The moment you discover that those who should protect you are the same ones planning your downfall, something inside you dies so that something else can be born. Hello, my dears. This is Grandma Barbara here, with my 73 years of life experience and a story that's been locked in my heart for over 4 decades. Today, I've decided to open up to you because certain truths need to come to light, even if they hurt when told. I'm sitting here on my porch in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, sipping my chamomile tea while watching the sunset paint the sky orange, ready to share for the first time the events that changed my life forever. Before I begin, please subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, and comment where you're watching this story from. Also, comment how many children or grandchildren you have. I'd be so happy to know. Let's go back to 1970, when I was just 18 years old and living in Millville, a small town in Ohio. We were a simple family, but we never lacked the essentials. My father, Jonah, worked as the manager of a general store downtown. He was a respected man, the kind who tipped his hat to greet ladies on the street and always had a joke ready to cheer up customers. My mother, Dorothy, was an elementary school teacher, loved by all her students. A woman with a sweet voice and always busy hands. When she wasn't grading papers, she was crocheting or making preserves that we sold to supplement our income. Our house was on a quiet street with a backyard where Mom grew everything from herbs to roses that were the pride of the neighborhood. We had an enormous cherry tree that, in season, attracted all the children from the street. Mom never minded. She said fruit on the tree was meant to be shared. "Nature doesn't know fences, Barbara dear," she would always say, with that serene smile that seemed to light up the room. It was under that same cherry tree that I met Paul when he passed by our street and saw a bunch of kids stretching to reach the fruits. He, with his 22 years and almost 6 feet tall, stopped to help. I remember it like it was yesterday. Me coming out through the back door with a pitcher of lemonade for the children and running into this tall young man with dark hair and honey-colored eyes, extending his arms to shake the highest branches of the tree. "Be careful not to break Mrs. Dorothy's branches," I said, trying to sound serious, but already feeling my heart race in a way I had never felt before. He turned, saw me, and smiled in a way that seemed to make time stop. "Sorry, I'm just helping the kids. This tree is so full, it's almost a sin to let the fruit go to waste, don't you think?" And so it began. Paul started showing up almost every day, always with a different excuse. Sometimes he wanted to know if we had lemons to sell, although everyone knew his mother had a lemon tree in her yard. Other times, he asked if he could help carry the groceries that Mom brought from the market. It was an old-fashioned courtship. Conversations at the gate, Sunday walks in the park, always chaperoned, little notes hidden in books we lent each other. My parents liked him from the start. Paul worked as an accountant at the only bank in town, had a guaranteed future, as my father said. He was respectful, didn't drink more than a glass of wine at Sunday lunches, attended church, the son-in-law every family dreamed of in those days. We got married in 1972 in a simple ceremony at the First Baptist Church. My dress was sewn by my Aunt Carmen, the cake made by Mom, the reception held in the church hall decorated with flowers from our garden. We didn't have much money, but we had love and our family's blessing, which, at that time, seemed more than enough to build a happy life. We moved to a small rented house a few blocks from my parents' home. 2 bedrooms, a small living room, kitchen, and a tiny backyard where I soon began planting my own flowers and herbs, following in my mother's footsteps. Paul would leave for the bank early in the morning, come home for lunch, which I made a point of preparing with all my love, and return to work until late afternoon. I took care of the house, did some embroidery to sell, and dreamed of the day when we would fill that second bedroom with a child. The first years were full of discoveries and adjustments, as in any marriage. We learned to live with each other's quirks. Him with his need to organize everything by size and color, me with my habit of leaving open books all over the house. We had our little arguments, of course, but nothing that wasn't resolved before bedtime. Paul was a good husband, attentive in his somewhat reserved way. Our lives followed a quiet and predictable rhythm until 1975, when Mom started complaining of stomach pains. At first, we thought it wasn't serious. Maybe gastritis, maybe stress from overwork at school. She was always the type who took care of everyone and forgot about herself. She tried some home remedies, took medicines the pharmacist recommended, But the pains didn't go away. When we finally convinced Mom to see a doctor, it was already too late. Stomach cancer. Advanced stage. The doctor, an elderly gentleman with gray hair and compassionate eyes, gave us the news straight, but gently. 6 months, maybe a year if we're lucky, he said, as I held my mother's cold hand and tried to process that this woman, who had always been a pillar of strength in our lives, was crumbling from within without us being able to do anything. The following months were a blur of hospitals, pain medications, and sleepless nights. Mom withered before our eyes, first losing her appetite, then her strength, finally even that smile that seemed capable of lighting up the world. Seeing someone you love suffer like this is like having your heart torn out piece by piece, every day. Paul was supportive during this period. He took care of the hospital bills, drove me back and forth every day, took over some household chores when I was too exhausted to do anything but cry. My father, on the other hand, seemed to have entered a strange kind of denial. He continued working at the store as if nothing was happening, visited Mom in the hospital with a forced smile and superficial conversations about the weather or town news. He never talked about the disease, never mentioned the future. Mom passed away on a rainy afternoon in July while I was holding her hand and reading passages from her favorite book. She simply closed her eyes during a pause in my reading and never opened them again. There were no dramatic last words or emotional goodbyes, just a final sigh, so soft I almost didn't notice. Just as she had lived, she departed with serenity. The funeral was simple, as she would have wanted. Many former students came, bringing flowers and stories about how Mrs. Dorothy had changed their lives. My father remained stoic throughout the ceremony, not shedding a tear, just occasionally squeezing my hand, as if to check if I was still there. It was only when we returned home, when the neighbors stopped bringing food and the condolence visits decreased, that I realized how destroyed my father was. I found him one night, sitting alone in the dark living room, looking at their wedding portrait. He wasn't crying. I never saw him cry, but there was something in his eyes that frightened me, a mixture of despair and emptiness, as if a crucial part of him had been buried along with Mom. "Dad," I called softly from the doorway. "You need to rest a little." He raised his eyes slowly, as if returning from far away. "I can't sleep in that bed, Barbara. Not without her." It was at that moment that I made a decision that would change our lives forever. "Why don't you come live with us for a while, until things get easier?" The offer left my lips naturally. After all, he was my father, the man who taught me to ride a bike, who took me on the back of his motorcycle for ice cream on Sundays, who never missed a school meeting. How could I leave him alone in his moment of greatest pain? Paul hesitated when I mentioned the invitation I had extended. He didn't say no directly, but I noticed his discomfort. "Our apartment is small, Barbara, and your father has always been so independent." "It's temporary," I argued, "just until he gets reorganized. He lost the love of his life, Paul. How would you feel in his place?" That seemed to convince him, or at least silence his objections. The following weekend, we arranged the little room that would be the baby's, who hadn't yet come, and helped Dad bring some of his things. "It's just for a little while," he promised, as he placed a worn suitcase at the foot of the bed. "I just need to absorb all this, find a way to go on without your mother." The first weeks were ones of adaptation. Dad was discreet, left early for work, and usually returned after we had already had dinner. On Sundays, he insisted on preparing lunch. He was an excellent cook, something Mom always praised. He seemed to be trying to find a new routine, a new purpose. Paul and he developed a cordial relationship. They weren't close. My husband was always more reserved, but they talked about politics, football, town news. Sometimes, when I came home, I would find the two of them sitting on the porch, having coffee and talking in low voices. But as the months passed, I began to notice small changes. Dad no longer talked about looking for a place just for himself. The few things he had brought gradually increased. More clothes, his favorite books, even the old armchair that was his favorite spot in the old house. It was as if he was slowly establishing himself, transforming what should have been temporary into permanent. Paul changed too. He began coming home later from work, claiming that the activity at the bank had increased or that he needed to work overtime. When questioned, he would become irritable, saying I didn't understand the pressures of his job. Gradually, that gentle and attentive man I met under the cherry tree was transformed into someone distant, impatient, almost a stranger. And then I began to notice something even more disturbing. When the three of us were together, on the rare occasions when this happened, there was a strange tension in the air. Conversations that ceased abruptly when I entered the room, exchanged glances that I couldn't decipher. It was as if there was a secret hovering in the house, something that only the two men in my life shared. I tried to talk to Paul about this one night, after Dad had already retired. "Is something going on that I should know about?" I asked as he prepared for bed. "What are you talking about?" he replied, without looking me in the eye. "About you and my father. You've been acting strange, talking in corners, changing the subject when I come near." He laughed, but there was no humor in that laugh. "You're imagining things, Barbara. Your father and I barely talk, actually, and when we do, it's about men's stuff. Nothing that would interest you." "Men's stuff," I repeated, feeling a twinge of hurt, as if I were some child who can't participate in adult conversations. "Don't twist my words," he said, his voice hardening. "I'm just saying there's no big mystery. If we're distant, it's because we're all tired. Me with work, you still dealing with your mother's grief, your father trying to rebuild his life. It's normal for things to be different." I accepted that explanation because I wanted to believe it. Because the alternative, that something was seriously wrong in my marriage, in my family, was too scary to confront. But the discomfort continued to grow, as did the distance between Paul and me. Our moments of intimacy, which were already rare since Mom's illness, became practically non-existent. He always had an excuse. He was tired, had a headache, needed to get up early the next day. When I tried to touch him, he would pull away as if my touch burned him. I began to question myself. Was I no longer attractive to him? Was the stress of having my father living with us affecting our marriage more than I realized? Or was it something worse? Another woman, perhaps. Doubt is a slow poison that contaminates everything. I began to observe Paul with different eyes, noticing small details I had previously ignored. The different smell when he came home late, the wrinkled shirts that didn't always look like they had spent the day in a bank office, the calls he answered in a low voice, moving away so I wouldn't hear. Meanwhile, Dad seemed increasingly comfortable in our home. He was no longer the broken man I invited to stay for a little while. He regained weight, started making jokes again, reassumed his place as a figure of authority, not just in his life, but also in my home. He had opinions about everything, how I should clean the cabinets, what kind of food I should prepare, even how I should dress. "That dress is too short for a married woman, Barbara," he commented once when I was getting ready to go out with a friend. "What will the neighbors think?" It was the same dress I had been wearing for years, nothing scandalous about it. But I swallowed the answer I wanted to give and simply changed clothes. After all, he was my father, he was suffering, and the least I could do was avoid unnecessary conflicts. That's how the months after Mom's death went. A slow transformation in the dynamics of our house. A subtle shift of power and intimacy, like a frog in a pot that doesn't notice the water gradually heating until it's too late to jump out. And too late was exactly what I would discover on an October night when everything I thought I knew about family, love, and trust would be destroyed in such a brutal way that I would never be able to look at the two men in my life with the same eyes again. It was a Friday in October when everything really began to fall apart. I remember perfectly because it was market day in town and I had woken up early to buy fresh fruit. I liked to prepare a special fruit salad on Fridays, a tradition I inherited from Mom. Natural sweetness to sweeten the end of the week, she always said. I returned from the market around 9 in the morning, carrying a cloth bag full of cantaloupe, bananas, oranges, and strawberries that a lady sold at the market entrance. They were expensive, the strawberries, but Paul loved them. At least the old Paul, the one who noticed my little gestures of affection. When I entered the house, I heard voices coming from the bedroom. I found it strange, because at that hour, both Paul and my father should have been at work. I approached the hallway silently, not out of suspicion, but out of pure curiosity. The door to our bedroom, mine and Paul's, was ajar, and I could clearly distinguish the voices of the two. "Can't take this situation anymore," Paul was saying, his voice low but loaded with frustration. It's been almost a year, Jonah. A year? You said it would be temporary. And what do you want me to do? My father's voice sounded harsh, almost defiant. Go back to that empty house? For what? To keep remembering her in every corner? I understand your pain, but this is destroying my marriage. Barbara senses something is wrong. Just yesterday, she questioned me about our conversations. There was a silence, and then my father's voice, now softer, almost persuasive. She doesn't know anything, and she won't, as long as you keep your mouth shut. It's not fair to her. Fair? My father laughed, a dry sound I had never heard from him before. Life isn't fair, my friend. My Dorothy died at 45 from a cancer that devoured her from within while I watched helplessly. Is that fair? Your situation with Barbara isn't even half my burden. They're different things, Jonah. You lost your wife, I understand, but nothing. My father's voice became cutting. We have an agreement. Or have you forgotten what you owe me? Another silence, longer this time. I stood paralyzed in the hallway, the fruit bag weighing on my arm, my heart beating so hard I feared they might hear. I haven't forgotten, Paul finally replied, his voice defeated. But I can't continue like this for much longer. You'll continue for as long as necessary, retorted my father, and I heard footsteps approaching the door. I quickly retreated to the kitchen, making as much noise as possible with the bags, as if I had just arrived. Seconds later, my father appeared, impeccably dressed in his gray suit, ready to go to work. Barbara, he exclaimed with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Up early today, huh? Did you bring those cheese rolls I like? I replied something. I don't even know what. My mind was boiling, trying to process what I had just heard. What agreement was that between my father and my husband? What did Paul owe my father that made him remain in a situation that clearly bothered him? I spent the rest of the day with these questions hammering in my head while mechanically performing my household tasks. I did laundry, cleaned the house, prepared the fruit salad that no one would eat. At night, when Paul arrived, I tried to act normally, but I must have been failing miserably because he looked at me suspiciously during dinner. Is everything okay, Barbara? You're quiet. Just tired, I lied, avoiding his eyes. I did a lot today. He nodded, visibly relieved not to have to maintain a conversation. My father, on the other hand, was talkative, telling stories from the store, making jokes that neither of us really found funny. It was as if we were all acting in a poorly rehearsed play, each interpreting a role that didn't fit. That night, lying next to Paul, who pretended to fall asleep as soon as he hit the bed, I made a decision. I needed to find out what was going on. I couldn't live in that farce anymore, in that climate of secrets and tension. In the following days, I started paying more attention to everything. The times Paul left and returned from work, the calls he received, the whispered conversations between him and my father. Once I caught Paul rummaging through my purse when he thought I was in the shower. What was he looking for? What did he fear I might discover? I approached Marianne, Paul's colleague at the bank, with whom I had a cordial relationship. I invited her for coffee at my house one afternoon when I knew neither Paul nor my father would be around. I've been worried about Paul, I confessed after some small talk. He's been working so much lately. He comes home so late, seems so stressed. Marianne hesitated, stirring her coffee for longer than necessary. Yeah, the bank has been pretty busy. All those overtime hours. It must be hard for everyone, right? She looked up, confused. Overtime? But we haven't been doing overtime for months. Since Mr. Mendez took over as manager, he's been pretty strict about closing time. I felt my stomach sink. But Paul has been getting home after 8 almost every day. He says he's working overtime. Marianne blushed, looking away. Barbara, maybe you should talk to your husband. Please, I insisted, holding her hand across the table. I need to know. What's going on? She sighed deeply. Look, I don't want to interfere in your marriage. Paul is a good colleague, always correct at work, but a few times a week, he leaves with a group after hours. They go to O'Malley's Tavern, sometimes to other places. I don't know more details, I swear. I just know he never stays at the bank after 6. O'Malley's Tavern. I knew it well. A place frequented mainly by men, where they served cheap whiskey, and there were women who weren't just there to serve tables. I thanked Marianne, and as soon as she left, I cried. I cried like I hadn't cried since my mother's death. Not just for the possible betrayal, but for the lie, for the theater we lived daily, for the fact that I couldn't even confront Paul without revealing that I had snooped, that I had interrogated his work colleague. I was trapped in a web of mistrust and half-truths. It was that same week that I noticed another disturbing change. My father, who had always been affectionate but respectful, began to touch me in ways that made me uncomfortable. Nothing explicit, nothing I could clearly point to as inappropriate. A hand that remained too long on my shoulder. A good morning kiss that came dangerously close to the corner of my mouth. Comments about how I looked pretty in that dress, or how I increasingly resembled my mother when she was young. I tried to push these thoughts away. After all, he was my father, the man who raised me, who educated me with solid values. Surely I was imagining things, projecting my insecurities about my marriage onto innocent gestures of paternal affection. But the discomfort persisted, growing with each small incident. One night, while I was washing the dinner dishes, I felt his presence behind me, too close. His hands landed on my waist, and I felt his hot breath on my neck. "You're more and more like her every day," he whispered. His voice choked with what I imagined to be emotion, or was it alcohol? I had noticed he had been drinking more lately, hiding bottles of whiskey in his room. I moved away delicately, pretending I needed to get a cloth to dry my hands. "You always say that, Dad." "Because it's true," he insisted, his eyes following me around the kitchen. "You have the same way of walking, the same smile. Sometimes when I see you out of the corner of my eye, it's as if she had come back." Those words gave me a chill. There was something in the tone, in the intensity of the gaze, that went beyond the simple nostalgic observation of a widower. It was as if, in his mind, the boundaries between mother and daughter were becoming dangerously blurred. "I think I'll go to bed early tonight," I announced, trying to keep my voice steady. "I have a bit of a headache." He nodded without taking his eyes off me. "Sleep well, Barbara. Dream of angels." Lying next to Paul, who once again had arrived late smelling of cigarettes and cheap liquor, I stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. I no longer recognized my life. I no longer recognized the men who shared that house with me. And worse, I was beginning to not recognize myself, the woman who allowed that situation to continue, who swallowed suspicions and discomforts to maintain a superficial peace. In the following weeks, things only got worse. Paul and I barely spoke, living like two strangers who shared a bed. My father became increasingly present, increasingly invasive in my personal space, and I, increasingly isolated, not knowing who to trust or who to turn to. My only close friend, Constance, had moved to Chicago after her marriage. My mother, my confidant of a lifetime, was no longer there. My school-time colleagues were all busy with their own families, their children, their lives that seemed to have followed a normal course, different from the strange paralysis in which mine found itself. One afternoon, while tidying my father's room, he insisted that only I enter there to clean, never allowing me to hire a cleaner. I found something that confirmed my worst suspicions. Under the mattress, carefully hidden, were photographs. Photographs of my mother, some of them in intimate situations that were clearly not taken for strangers' eyes, and alongside them, magazine clippings with women who looked like me, like my mother. Women in suggestive poses, wearing lingerie or less than that. I recoiled in horror, leaving everything as it was. What did that mean? I always knew my parents had a passionate marriage, but those photos? There was something sick in the way they were organized, cataloged, as if they were part of some secret obsession. I left the room feeling nauseous, trying to organize my thoughts. I needed to talk to someone, needed help to understand what was happening. But who would believe me? Who would believe that the respected Mr. Jonah, store manager, dedicated widower, exemplary father, kept that kind of material? Who would believe that my own father looked at me in a way that made my skin crawl? It was on that same day, like a sign from fate, that I ran into Sally, an old neighbor from the house where I grew up. She had moved to Millville after her husband's death, and we met by chance at the market. Seeing my haggard face, my lusterless eyes, she insisted we have coffee. "You don't look well, girl," she said, always direct. "What's happening? Is it the marriage?" Something in the kindness of her eyes, in the genuine concern in her voice, broke my last defenses. I told her everything. Paul's lies, my father's strange behavior, the photographs I had found. I told her about the conversation I had overheard, about the agreement that seemed to exist between the two. Sally listened to everything in silence, her wrinkled face contorting into an expression of growing concern. When I finished, she held my hands between hers, rough from a lifetime of work. "Barbara, you need to get out of that house. As soon as possible." "But where to? I don't have my own money. I have nowhere to go." "Come to my house," she offered without hesitation. "I live alone. I have a spare room. It's not much, but it's safe." I considered the offer, tempted to accept it immediately. But something held me back. Perhaps the last thread of hope that I was interpreting everything wrong, that there was an innocent explanation for the behavior of those two men. "I need to be sure, Sally. I need to know what's really going on before I make such a drastic decision." She squeezed my fingers hard. "Be careful, girl. Men can be dangerous creatures when they feel they're losing control." I returned home that day with a plan forming in my mind. I would confront Paul, demand the truth about his nightly outings, about his agreement with my father. Depending on what I discovered, I would make my decision, stay and fight for my marriage, or accept Sally's offer and restart my life. What I didn't know, as I entered the house with that new determination, was that fate had its own plans for me. Plans that would unfold in such a terrible way that they would forever change not just my life, but also my understanding of human nature and the limits of the evil that hides behind the masks of respectability. That night would be the longest of my life, the night when all the lies would fall, when the truth would emerge from the shadows with all its horrific clarity, the night that would teach me that sometimes monsters don't hide under the bed, but sleep in it, by our side. It was a Thursday. The calendar hanging in the kitchen marked October 23, 1975, a date that would be etched in my soul as if it had been branded with a hot iron. That afternoon, Paul came home earlier than usual, around 5. I found it strange, as in recent weeks he rarely appeared before 8. He was pale, agitated, his restless eyes avoiding mine as he mumbled something about not feeling well. "I'll make some tea for you," I offered, still trying to be the devoted wife, still pretending we lived in a normal marriage. "I don't want any tea," he replied harshly. "I'm going to lie down for a bit, and don't disturb me." I stood in the living room, holding a dish towel, watching him disappear down the hallway. Something in his behavior was different from the usual, not just the rudeness, which I was unfortunately getting used to, but a kind of nervous urgency, as if he were running from something, or preparing for something. My father arrived around 6, more animated than I had seen him in some time. He brought a bottle of wine, which was unusual. He generally preferred stronger drinks. "Where's Paul?" he asked as he placed the bottle on the kitchen table. "Lying down. He's not feeling well." A hard-to-decipher expression crossed his face. Disappointment? Irritation? Too bad. "I brought this wine to celebrate." "Celebrate what, Dad?" He smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Life, Barbara. There's always something to celebrate in life, don't you think?" I prepared dinner as usual, although my stomach was too knotted to feel hungry. Paul didn't appear to eat. When I took a plate to the bedroom, I found him dressed, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring fixedly at the wall. "I'm not hungry," he said before I could say anything. "And I'm going out later. Don't wait up for me." "Going out? But you said you weren't feeling well." He gave me an icy look. "I need to take care of some things. It's important." I didn't insist. Deep down, maybe I already knew what that outing meant, or thought I knew. I returned to the kitchen, where my father was dining alone, already on his second glass of wine. He had turned on the radio and was softly humming along with an old song he used to dance to with my mother at family gatherings. "Paul is going out," I commented, sitting at the table with a plate I would barely touch. My father made a dismissive gesture with his hand. "Let him. Men's business." That expression again. Men's business. As if there existed a secret world to which I, being a woman, would never have access. A code between them that I couldn't decipher. We ate in silence. Or rather, he ate while I pushed the food from one side of the plate to the other. He offered me wine several times, insisting when I refused. "You're very tense, daughter. A little wine will help you relax." I ended up giving in, more to avoid arguments than out of desire. The wine had a slightly bitter taste, but I attributed this to my lack of habit with alcoholic beverages. I drank only half a glass, but soon felt a strange torpor spreading through my body, a drowsiness that seemed disproportionate to that small amount of alcohol. I think I'll go to bed, Dad. I'm feeling strange. He got up promptly. Let me help you. You really do look a bit dizzy. His hand on my waist, guiding me down the hallway, seemed to burn through the thin fabric of my dress. I tried to move away discreetly, but my legs were heavy, my coordination compromised. Can you change by yourself? He asked when we reached the door of my room. Of course, I replied, striving to make my voice sound firm. I just need to sleep a bit. Good night, Dad. I entered the room and closed the door, turning the key in the lock, an instinctive gesture of protection that I had never done before. I heard his footsteps slowly moving away down the hallway, as if he was reluctant to leave me. I sat on the bed, trying to organize my thoughts which seemed wrapped in cotton. Why was I feeling this way? A glass of wine would never affect me like this. Unless a shiver ran down my spine when understanding hit me. Had my father put something in my drink? The idea seemed absurd, paranoid, but considering everything I had observed in recent weeks, I couldn't completely rule it out. I fought against the drowsiness that threatened to overwhelm me. I needed to stay awake, alert. If my father had really planned something, it wouldn't be safe to fall asleep with him still in the house. Maybe I should leave, go to Sally's house, ask for help. But my body wasn't obeying. My limbs were heavy, my vision blurred. With great effort, I managed to change clothes and lie down. I'll just rest a bit, I thought, until I feel better to get out of here. I don't know how long I stayed in that state of semi-consciousness, floating between sleep and wakefulness. At some point, I heard the front door open and close. Paul leaving, I presumed. Then footsteps down the hallway, the sound of the TV on in the living room, the tinkling of a glass being set on the table. My father, passing the time, waiting. Waiting for what? I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I remember is waking up startled with the feeling that someone was in the room. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the living room wall. The darkness was almost complete. Only a weak light from the street lamp filtered through the curtain. That's when I realized. The bedroom door was open. I was absolutely certain I had locked it before lying down. My heart raced, fear instantly dissipating any remnant of drowsiness. I tried to sit up, but my body was still slow, clumsy, and then I heard it, a breathing. Not mine, but another, heavy, too close. Who's there? I asked, my voice sounding strangely distant to my own ears. Silence. Then, the creaking of the wooden floor. Someone moving in the darkness of the room. Paul? I called, although I knew it wasn't him. Paul had left. I had heard him leave. No, Barbara. My father's voice emerged from the shadows, slurred and different from usual. Paul isn't here. It's just the two of us now. I felt the mattress sink as he sat on the edge of the bed. The strong smell of whiskey emanated from him, mixed with his usual cologne, creating a nauseating combination. Dad, what are you doing here? I was sleeping. Shh, he whispered, his hand finding my face in the dark, caressing my cheek in a way that made my blood freeze. You don't need to pretend with me, Dorothy. I know you've missed me as much as I've missed you. Dorothy. He called me by my mother's name. Dad, it's me, Barbara, I said, trying to keep my voice calm as I moved away from his touch. Your daughter. He chuckled softly, a disturbing sound in the darkness. Always playful, my Dorothy. You always liked these little games. His hand moved down my neck, then lower, touching me in a way no father should touch a daughter. I tried to push him away, but my arms were weak, my movements too slow. Stop! I shouted, panic growing in my chest. I'm your daughter! Your daughter! For a moment he seemed to hesitate. Then he leaned over me, his face so close I could feel his hot, alcoholic breath. I know very well who you are. And I know what you want, what you've always wanted. You're just making this harder, like she used to. With a sudden movement, he grabbed my wrists, pinning them above my head with one hand while the other tore my nightgown. I screamed, I struggled, I fought with all the strength I could gather in my drugged body. But he was stronger, much stronger. "No one will hear you," he said, his voice now cold, calculating. "And even if they did, who would believe? The respectable Mr. Jonah, harming his own daughter? Impossible." The tears streamed down my face as he continued, relentless. I begged. I called for God, for my mother, for anyone who could help me. But no one came. At some point, when the pain and humiliation had already surpassed any limit I thought I was capable of enduring, he stopped. He sat on the edge of the bed, his back curved, his breathing heavy, as if he had suddenly realized the monstrosity of what he had just done. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way." I curled up against the headboard, pulling the torn sheet to cover my violated body, unable to speak, to cry, to feel anything beyond an immense, icy emptiness. He got up abruptly. "I'm going to take a shower, and you're going to stay quiet there. Not a word about this. Understood?" When he left, closing the door behind him, I remained motionless, in a state of shock. The minutes dragged on like hours as I listened to the distant sounds of water running in the bathroom, then doors opening and closing, footsteps around the house. Slowly, the reality of what had happened began to penetrate the fog of horror that enveloped my mind. My own father, the man who should protect me, I couldn't even formulate the complete thought. It was too absurd, too monstrous to fit into words. And Paul? Where was Paul during all this? Why had he left precisely that night? The conversation I had overheard weeks before came back to my mind. "We have an agreement. Or have you forgotten what you owe me?" A terrible thought began to form. Was it possible that Paul knew? That he had allowed it? Or worse, arranged it? The idea was so horrible that I almost laughed at its absurdity. My husband might be many things. Distant, dishonest, possibly unfaithful. But he wouldn't be complicit in something so perverse, would he? I don't know how long I stayed there, paralyzed by shock and fear. At some point, the sky began to slowly lighten outside the window. The birds began to sing. Indifferent to the horror that had unfolded during the night, the world kept turning, as if nothing had happened. I dragged myself out of bed, each movement causing pain. My entire body seemed like one open wound. I staggered to the bathroom, locked the door, and got under the shower fully clothed in what remained of my torn nightgown. I let the hot water, as hot as I could bear, fall over me while I scrubbed every inch of my skin until it was red and sore. I wanted to wash everything away, erase every mark, every touch. But I knew that no amount of water or soap could clean what had been so deeply defiled. When I finally left the bathroom, hours later, the house was silent. My father had left, probably for work, as if it were a normal day. As if the night before he hadn't destroyed my life, my trust, my very notion of who I was. Paul still hadn't returned. Where had he spent the night? With whom? While I was living the worst nightmare of my existence, where was the man who had sworn to protect me and love me, for better or for worse? I dressed mechanically, choosing clothes that covered as much of my body as possible. Each bruise, each scratch on my skin was a silent accusation, proof of what had happened. I needed to hide them, from others and from myself. What to do now? Where to go? Who to tell? Who would believe me against the word of the esteemed Mr. Jonah? In 1975, in a small town, an accusation like that would be received with disbelief, if not with contempt. She must have provoked it, some would say. She's making up stories, others would say. Family problems are resolved at home, the most conservative would sentence. Sitting at the kitchen table with an untouched cup of coffee in front of me, I tried to organize my thoughts. I needed to leave that house, that was certain. I could not spend another night under the same roof as my father. Sally's offer to welcome me into her home never seemed so providential. But before leaving, I needed to understand. I needed to know what Paul's role was in all this. If he knew, if he had allowed it, if he was part of that horror. And so, immersed in those dark thoughts, I heard him arrive. The front door opening, dragging footsteps down the hallway. The unmistakable smell of cheap perfume and cigarettes that for months had accompanied him when he returned from his outings. Paul entered the kitchen looking exhausted, his hair disheveled, his unshaven face, his bloodshot eyes. He stopped when he saw me sitting at the table, as if he didn't expect to find me there. "Barbara, I thought you would still be sleeping." I looked at him, really looked, trying to see beyond the facade, trying to find in the man before me some trace of the boy I fell in love with years ago. I found nothing. "Where were you, Paul?" I asked, my voice surprisingly firm. He hesitated, running his hand through his hair in a nervous gesture I knew well. "Working. I told you. I had to." "Don't lie to me," I interrupted, hitting my hand on the table with a force I didn't know I possessed. "Don't you dare lie to me today. Not after what happened." He frowned, clearly confused by my reaction. "What are you talking about? What happened?" I studied his face, looking for some sign that he was pretending, that he knew exactly what I was talking about, but all I saw was genuine perplexity. "My father," I finally said, each word like a heavy stone on my tongue. "My father came into our room last night, after you left." Paul visibly paled, grabbing the edge of the sink as if he needed support to stand. What did he do?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. I couldn't answer directly. How to put that horror into words? How to describe the indescribable? "Did you know?" I asked instead. "Did you know what he was planning to do?" "No." The answer came quick, shocked. "How can you think that? I would never." "Never? Then why did you leave last night? Why did you leave me alone with him, knowing how strange he had been lately?" Paul sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. "I just needed some time. He was suffocating me, suffocating us. This stupid agreement." "What agreement, Paul? What is this agreement that you mention so much?" He raised his eyes, his face a mask of guilt and despair. "Money. It's about money, Barbara. Your father lent a large sum so I could help my mother when she got sick, even before I met you. When we started dating, he said I wouldn't need to pay if what? If I married you and let him live with us when he needed to." The revelation fell like lightning on a clear day. My marriage, what I believed to be the fruit of love, was nothing more than a financial transaction, a debt being paid. "So you never loved me?" I asked, the pain of this betrayal almost eclipsing the horror of the previous night. "Almost. Not at first," he admitted, his gaze lowered. "But later, with time, I learned to like you, Barbara. You're a good wife, a good woman." "Like," I repeated bitterly. "Not love, like." He didn't answer, which was answer enough. "And now?" I continued, my voice carrying a coldness I didn't recognize in myself. "Now that you know what he did to me, what will you do?" Paul rose abruptly, walking from one side to the other of the small kitchen like a caged animal. "We need to report him. Go to the police." I laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "The police? And you think they'll believe me over him? You know this town as well as I do, Paul. You know how it works. Then let's leave. Today. We'll pack our things and disappear from here." I looked at him, this man I thought I knew, who I thought loved me, and saw only a coward trying to save his own skin. Running away wouldn't erase what had happened. It wouldn't return what had been taken from me. "Leave if you want," I said, getting up from the chair. "I'm going to Sally's house. Alone. Barbara, please, we need to stick together at this moment. I know I was wrong, that I lied, but—" "No," I interrupted firmly. "It's over, Paul. Everything is over." I turned to leave the kitchen, determined to take only the essentials and leave that house of horrors forever. But his next words made me freeze. "He'll come back, Barbara. And if he did this once..." The icy fear that those words provoked was immediately replaced by something hotter, more potent: anger. A pure and absolute anger that I had never felt before. My father would return, yes. He would return home that afternoon, after a normal day of work, expecting to find everything as always: dinner on the table, the house tidy, his daughter submissive and silent. Expecting that the terror of the previous night would be enough to ensure my silence, my obedience. But he didn't know me. Not really. He didn't know the strength that exists inside a woman when everything is taken from her, when there is nothing left to lose. I slowly turned to Paul, an idea forming in my mind. A terrible idea, but also terribly just. "You're right," I said, my voice calm now, calculating. He will come back, and we need to be ready when that happens. You must be wondering what goes through the mind of a woman who has just discovered that her marriage was a farce and that her own father committed the most unforgivable act possible. It's not anger. It's not just pain. It's an immense emptiness that soon fills with a frightening clarity. As I watched Paul in our kitchen that morning, trembling and pale in the face of the revelation of what had happened, I realized that I didn't know him. I never knew him. The man I fell in love with never existed. He was just a mask worn by someone who agreed to marry me to pay a debt. And yet, pathetic as he was, he would be useful for what I needed to do. "Tell me everything," I demanded, sitting back at the table. "I want to know every detail of this agreement between you two." Paul hesitated, running his hand over his tired face. I noticed that he weighed his words, calculating how much he should reveal. Even now, after everything, he was still trying to protect himself. 6 years ago, before I met you, my mother became very ill, he finally began. She needed an expensive surgery that the public system didn't cover. I didn't have the money, nor could I get a loan from the bank being so young. That's when I met your father at the store. He saw me desperate, asked what had happened, and offered help. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. My father, the great benefactor, always willing to help others. Paul ignored my sarcasm and continued. "The money saved my mother, Barbara. I couldn't refuse. Your father said I could pay when I could, without interest, without pressure. It seemed like a miracle." "And when did the miracle turn into a nightmare?" I asked, my voice hard as stone. "Almost a year later, when I started working at the bank. I had managed to save some money and went to look for him to start paying. That's when he said he had a better proposal." Paul paused, his eyes fixed on the table. "He said he had a beautiful daughter, accomplished, from a good family, that she needed a good husband, someone with a future. If I agreed to date her, get to know her, and eventually marry her, he would consider the debt settled." Each word was like a knife twisting in my chest. I, who had always believed I had been chosen for love, was nothing more than a bargaining chip, a commodity negotiated between men. "And you accepted, of course," I stated, the bitter taste of truth on my tongue. "I agreed to meet you," he corrected, as if that made any difference. "The rest happened naturally. You were beautiful, kind, easy to like, but not to love," I completed. He didn't answer, confirming with his silence what I already knew. "And when my mother got sick, when I invited my father to live with us, was that also part of the agreement?" Paul looked away. "Your father always made it clear that one day he might need this favor. When your mother died, he approached me, said it was time for me to fully repay his generosity, that he needed a place to stay and that I should convince you to invite him. But I offered on my own," I recalled, confused, "because he instructed me to plant the idea, to make you think it was your own initiative." For the first time since we began that conversation, I saw true shame on his face. "I manipulated you, Barbara, following his instructions." A chill ran down my spine as I understood the extent of the plot. My father hadn't simply taken advantage of an opportunity. He had planned everything, meticulously, probably since the day my mother received the fatal diagnosis. "And the night outings? O'Malley's Tavern? The women?" I asked, needing to hear the complete truth, however painful it might be. Paul sighed deeply. "At first, it was just an excuse to get out of the house. Your father, he was becoming increasingly strange, more controlling. I needed air, space. Then it became a habit, an escape. An escape from what, exactly? From your fake marriage? From your wife who you pretended to love? From everything," he admitted, defeated. "From the guilt, the shame, the regret. From knowing I was living a life built on lies. And last night? Why did you leave precisely last night?" It was at this moment that I saw something change in Paul's face. A mixture of hesitation and fear that made me sit more erect, alert. "Your father told me to leave," he finally confessed, his voice almost inaudible. "Said he needed some time alone with you. To talk." I froze. Talk? Was that the word he used? "He said he wanted to have a serious conversation with you, about your behavior, that you had been suspicious, asking too many questions, and that he needed to set you straight. And you believe that?" Paul lowered his eyes. "I don't know. Maybe, or maybe I just wanted to believe, to not have to face the possibility of something worse. The nausea rose in my throat with such force that I had to lean on the table to avoid falling. He knew, maybe not explicitly, maybe he didn't want to admit even to himself, but on some level, Paul knew what my father was planning to do. "You sold me," I said, the words coming out like poison. "You sold me to him." "No, it wasn't like that. I never imagined that he would." "A monster," I completed. "Either you never imagined or you didn't want to imagine. Either way, your cowardice cost me everything." We sat in silence for long minutes, the ticking of the clock on the wall marking the time of a life that no longer existed. The woman I was yesterday, naive, confident, protected by the love I believed I had died that night. In her place was someone I didn't yet fully know, someone forged in pain and betrayal. "What are we going to do now?" Paul finally asked, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "There is no we, Paul. Not after this. There is only what I'm going to do and what you're going to do to help me if you have a minimum of decency left in you." He nodded slowly, resigned. "What do you want me to do?" That's when I heard knocks at the front door. 3 firm knocks, followed by a female voice calling my name. I immediately recognized it. It was Sally, my old neighbor. "Wait here," I instructed Paul, getting up to answer the door. Sally was standing on the porch, her face marked with concern. "I couldn't sleep all night thinking about you, girl. I came to see how you are." The simple gesture of genuine concern, something I hadn't experienced in so long, almost broke my newly discovered strength. I held back tears and invited her in. When we reached the kitchen, Paul was still sitting at the table, looking smaller and more pathetic than ever. "Who are you?" Sally asked without beating around the bush, evaluating him with suspicious eyes. "This is Paul, my husband," I introduced, the word husband sounding false on my lips. "Paul, this is Sally, a trusted friend." Something in the tone of my voice must have alerted Sally that the situation was serious. She looked from me to Paul, then back to me, and asked directly, "What happened, Barbara? You look terrible." I hadn't planned to tell. Not so soon, not before deciding exactly what I would do. But suddenly, the words simply came out, like water breaking through a dam. I told everything. The violence of the previous night, the revelation of the agreement between Paul and my father, the life of lies I had lived without knowing. Sally listened to everything in silence, her face hardening with each new detail. When I finished, she stood up and, without warning, slapped Paul's face so hard that the sound echoed through the kitchen. "You worm!" she exclaimed, trembling with rage. "A real man protects his wife, doesn't deliver her to be abused." Paul didn't react, just lowered his head, accepting the blow as if he knew he deserved much worse. Sally turned to me, her eyes now soft, maternal. "Let's get out of here right now, girl. Get your things. You're going to stay at my house until we decide what to do." I hesitated. Part of me wanted exactly that, to flee, to leave that house and the horrible memories behind. But another part, a part I didn't know until then, wanted justice, or something close to it. "I can't go yet," I replied slowly. "My father returns from work at 6. If I simply disappear, he'll know I told. He'll have time to create a story, to defame me, to make it seem like I'm an ungrateful daughter making up lies about a dedicated father." "And what do you intend to do?" asked Sally, her forehead wrinkled with concern. I looked at Paul, then at Sally, feeling a strange calm spread through my body. The calm that comes after you've lost everything, when there's nothing more to fear. "I need a witness," I said simply. "Someone who confirms my version when it's all over." Sally paled, immediately understanding what I hadn't explicitly said. "Barbara, this is dangerous, very dangerous. More dangerous than staying in this house? Than waiting until he decides he's entitled to another night with the daughter who looks so much like his dead wife?" My voice was calm, but loaded with a determination I had never felt before. Sally must have noticed this, because she nodded slowly. "What exactly do you have in mind?" I explained my simple, direct plan, born from the crystalline clarity that only absolute despair can provide. When I finished, both Sally and Paul looked at me with a mixture of horror and admiration. "Will it work?" asked Paul, his voice trembling. It has to work, I replied, because we have no other option. The following hours were of meticulous preparation. Sally left and returned with items we needed. Paul, moved by guilt or by a last remnant of decency, followed my instructions without questioning. I myself moved around the house with a mechanical efficiency, as if I were outside my body, observing someone else performing those tasks. At 5:30, everything was ready. Sally hid in the guest room, with the door ajar so she could hear and see what would happen in the living room. Paul sat in the living room armchair, a glass of whiskey in his hand, not to drink, but to complete the staging. At 5:45, I heard the familiar footsteps on the sidewalk, the creaking of the iron gate, the key turning in the lock. My heart raced, but my resolution didn't falter. My father entered, hanging his hat on the coat rack beside the door as he did every day. He stopped when he saw Paul sitting in the living room at that hour, clearly surprised. "Paul? I thought you would be at the bank at this hour." Before Paul could answer, I came out of the kitchen, drying my hands on a dish towel, like the dedicated wife I had always been. "Good afternoon, Dad," I greeted, my voice surprisingly steady. Paul wasn't feeling well today. He came home early. My father looked me up and down, and for a terrible instant I thought I saw a glint of recognition in his eyes. Not the recognition of a father for a daughter, but that of a man for a woman he had possessed. I swallowed the bile that rose in my throat and forced a smile. "Dinner is almost ready," I continued. "Why don't you sit down for a bit? It must have been a tiring day at the store." He nodded, apparently calm, as if the night before hadn't happened, as if he hadn't destroyed my life, my trust, my very notion of who I was. "A day like any other," he replied, heading to his favorite armchair. "What do we have for dinner?" "Your favorite dish," I replied, feeling the words bitter in my mouth. "Roast chicken with potatoes. Exactly like Mom used to make." I saw his eyes soften at the mention of my mother. Even after everything, her name still had power over him. "Great," he said, settling into the armchair. "I'm starving." Paul and I exchanged a quick look. It was time. The moment that would define the rest of our lives had arrived. And although my heart was beating like a drum in my chest, my hands were steady and my mind clear. The truth would be revealed. Not just the truth about the previous night, but all the truths that had been hidden from me for so many years. And with this revelation, I would finally find the freedom I didn't even know I had lost. What happened next would forever change, not only my life, but that of everyone involved. A sequence of events that began with a simple confrontation and ended, well, that's a story that deserves to be told with all the details. But before we continue, I need you to understand something fundamental. Sometimes, when all institutions fail to protect us, when society turns its back on our suffering, we need to create our own justice. And that's exactly what I did that day in October 1975, when I finally understood that the people I trusted most were precisely those who had planned my downfall. "Dad," I called, my voice calm, as I sat on the sofa across from his armchair. "We need to talk about what happened last night." I saw his body immediately stiffen, his fingers gripping the arms of the chair. His eyes jumped to Paul, then back to me, calculating, assessing the situation. "I don't know what you're talking about, Barbara," he replied with a forced smile. "Yesterday was a day like any other. We had dinner, watched some TV, and went to bed." "It wasn't quite like that, and you know it," I insisted, keeping my tone soft, almost conversational. "You put something in my drink. Then you came into my room and did things that a father should never do to a daughter." The silence that followed was so dense it could be cut with a knife. My father looked at me as if I had two heads. Paul kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his knuckles white from gripping the whiskey glass so tightly. "You're delirious," my father finally said, his voice hardening. "Maybe we should take you to a doctor. Since your mother passed away, you haven't been the same, getting more nervous, more unstable every day." It was exactly what I expected. The denial, followed by the attempt to make me seem crazy, classic, predictable. "It's interesting that you mention that," I responded, still maintaining my calm. "Because I've been thinking a lot about Mom lately. About how she died. About how you reacted to her illness." Something darkened in his eyes. "What does your mother have to do with your absurd accusations?" "Everything, actually." I found the photographs, Dad. Those you keep under the mattress. The photos of her. And the magazine clippings with women who look like me, like her. It was as if the air had been sucked from the room. My father visibly paled, his gaze now truly alarmed. "You've been going through my things," he accused, his voice low, dangerous. "Just as you went through mine last night," I retorted, feeling the first pang of anger break through my facade of calm. "The difference is that I only looked at your photos. You violated much more than my privacy." My father rose abruptly, pointing a trembling finger at Paul. "Is this what you allow in your house? That your wife makes unfounded accusations against her own father? That she goes through my personal belongings? That she invents sick stories?" Paul finally raised his eyes, his face a mask of shame and determination. "I know everything, Mr. Jonah. I know what you did to Barbara. I also know about our agreement, about how you manipulated me all these years. It's over. I won't allow you to hurt my wife anymore." My father laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Your wife? Since when do you care about her? You, who spend nights at O'Malley's with women of ill repute? You, who only married her to settle a debt with me?" Each word was like a new stab, but I was already too numb to feel the full impact. Besides, there was nothing there that I didn't already know. "That's true, Dad," I agreed. "Paul is no better than you. He betrayed me, lied to me, used me. But at least he never pretended to be something he wasn't. You, on the other hand, you pretended to be a loving father while planning." "Be careful what you're about to say, girl," he interrupted, his voice now trembling with anger. "Think carefully before making accusations you can't prove." It was my turn to smile, a cold smile that didn't reach my eyes. "But I can prove it, Dad. I have the marks on my body, I have the stained sheets, and I have a witness." As if on cue in a well-rehearsed play, Sally came out of the hallway and entered the living room, her arms crossed over her chest, her face a mask of determination. My father took a step back, genuinely surprised. "Who is this woman? What is she doing in my house?" "In your house?" I repeated, raising my eyebrows. "I thought this was Paul's and my house. You're just a guest, remember? A guest who promised to stay only temporarily, until you recovered from the loss of your wife." Sally advanced, positioning herself by my side. "My name is Sally Morera, Mr. Jonah. I'm Barbara's friend, and I heard everything that was said here today. Just as I heard what happened in the house during the night. The walls are thin, you know, and a cry of pain is hard to ignore, even with the door closed." It was a lie, of course. Sally wasn't in the house the previous night. But my father didn't know that. All he saw was another witness, another person who could confirm my story. "This is a conspiracy," he said, retreating another step. "You three have set this up against me. Why? To get my money? My pension?" "We don't want your money, Dad," I replied calmly. "We just want you to leave our house, today, now, and never come back." He laughed again, but this time there was a touch of desperation in the sound. "And if I refuse, what will you do? Drag me out? Call the police?" "Exactly," I confirmed, keeping my gaze steady. "We'll go to the police station. We'll tell everything. The abuse, the agreement with Paul, the photographs. And when Sheriff Wilson, who, I should remind you, has 2 teenage daughters, hears what you did to your own daughter, well, I don't think he's going to be very understanding, even if you are a respected citizen." The name of Sheriff Wilson wasn't chosen by accident. He was known in town for his rigorous stance against sexual crimes, especially after his niece was attacked by a stranger the year before. The mention of his name made my father pale even more. "You wouldn't be capable," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "You wouldn't do this to your own father. Just as you wouldn't be capable of doing what you did to me?" I asked, tilting my head. "I think we've already established that appearances can be deceiving, haven't we?" He looked around, like a cornered animal seeking an escape route. His eyes met Paul's, looking for some sign of alliance, some indication that their old agreement still held some value. "Paul," he called, his voice almost pleading now. "You know she's exaggerating. You know I wouldn't do something like this. Think of everything I did for you, for your mother." Paul slowly shook his head. "You bought my silence once, Mr. Jonah. You won't buy it again." Something changed in my father's face. The mask of the respectable man, of the loving father, fell completely, revealing something ugly and dangerous underneath. "You think you can threaten me?" he growled, advancing a step in my direction. "You think 3 against 1 will intimidate me? I am Jonah Ferreira. I am respected in this town. My word is worth more than that of all 3 of you put together." I calmly stood up, facing his gaze with a firmness I didn't know I possessed. "You're right about one thing, Dad. Your word is worth a lot in this town. Or it was, until now." I walked to the sideboard in the living room and picked up a manila envelope that I had left there earlier. I extended it to him. "What is this?" he asked, without touching the envelope. "Open it and see." Reluctantly, he took the envelope and opened it. Inside were copies of the photographs I had found in his room, the most explicit, the most disturbing ones. Along with them, a letter detailing everything he had done to me, with dates, times, details that only the victim or the aggressor would know. "I made several copies of this," I explained as he leafed through the contents, his face increasingly pale. "One is with Sally, another with Paul's wife, one more with my former teacher. If anything happens to me, if you try to silence me in any way, these letters will be delivered to every influential person in this town, the pastor, the judge, the sheriff. Your reputation will be destroyed, your name tarnished forever." It wasn't true, of course. The only copy that existed was the one he held in his hands, but again, he had no way of knowing that. All he saw was his own destruction, carefully documented, ready to be revealed to the world. "You wouldn't do that," he whispered, but without conviction. "You would ruin your own name, too. You would be the monster's daughter. No one in this town would look at you the same way." "Do you really think I care about that at this point?" I asked, feeling a strange, almost supernatural calm. "You've already taken everything from me. My trust, my innocence, my faith in people. What else do I have to lose?" There was a long moment of silence as he evaluated me, trying to determine if I was bluffing or not. Something in my eyes must have convinced him, because he finally lowered his head, defeated. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice almost inaudible. "I already said, I want you to leave this house, today, now, and never come back. I want you to leave Millville and go far away, where I'll never have to look at your face or hear your voice again. In exchange, I'll keep these letters stored away. No one will ever know what happened here." He raised his eyes, a last spark of defiance still visible. "And if I refuse, then we'll all go to the police station right now," I replied without hesitation. "You can try to explain to Sheriff Wilson why you have intimate photos of your late wife hidden along with pornographic magazine clippings. You can try to justify the bruises on my body and the blood on my sheets. You can try to convince him that 3 people are lying about the same event, with the same details." Sally stepped forward, her hard eyes fixed on my father. "And if that's not enough, I can testify about other cases I know about how you used to look at young girls in the neighborhood where we grew up, about comments you made when you thought no one was listening. I have a good memory, Mr. Jonah, and many stories to tell. More lies, of course, but convincing enough by the way my father paled even more, if that was possible." He looked around one last time, as if seeking a magical way out of that situation. Then slowly, he placed the envelope on the table. "Give me an hour," he finally said, "to pack my things." 30 minutes, I countered. "And Sally will accompany you to ensure you don't take anything that doesn't belong to you, and to ensure you don't try anything imprudent." He nodded mechanically, like a man in a trance, and headed to the hallway that led to his room. Sally followed him, giving me an encouraging look before disappearing down the hallway. When we were alone, Paul collapsed on the sofa, his head in his hands. "You were amazing," he murmured. "I never imagined you had so much strength." "Neither did I admitted, finally feeling the tremor that I had kept under control during the entire confrontation. "But I had no choice, did I? You and my father took care of that." He raised his eyes, brimming with tears. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, Barbara. I know that what I did, what I allowed to happen, is unforgivable. But I want you to know that I am truly sorry and that I will do anything to try to fix this." I looked at him, really looked, and saw for the first time the man behind the mask. He wasn't a monster like my father, but he wasn't the hero I had imagined when we got married either. He was just a weak, cowardly man who had made terrible choices and was now facing the consequences. "Some things can't be fixed, Paul," I responded with a painful honesty. "What was broken between us cannot be mended. But you can help ensure that I can move forward, that I can rebuild my life, away from here, away from these memories." "What do you want me to do?" he asked, and there was a sincerity in his voice that I hadn't heard in a long time. "I want a divorce. I want half of the house, which is rightfully mine, and I want your help to sell my share so I can start over somewhere else." He nodded without hesitation. "All of that is yours by right, and more if you want. I'll do whatever is necessary to facilitate your departure." Exactly 28 minutes later, my father came out of the bedroom carrying 2 suitcases. Sally came right behind, vigilant. He crossed the living room without looking at me or Paul, heading straight for the front door. Only when his hand touched the doorknob did he call me, without turning around. "Barbara." "Yes?" I replied, maintaining my distance. "You won't get rid of me so easily. This isn't over." There was no explicit threat in his words, but the tone made it clear that this would not be the last time we would hear from him. Sally stepped forward, ready to intervene, but I raised my hand, signaling that everything was okay. "Yes, it is over, Dad," I replied calmly. "You just haven't realized it yet." He opened the door and left without looking back. The sound of his footsteps moving away down the sidewalk was the sweetest music I had ever heard. When the iron gate slammed, indicating he had left our property, I collapsed on the sofa, all strength suddenly draining from my body. Sally ran to my side, hugging me as violent sobs shook my body. They weren't tears of sadness, but of relief, of liberation. Paul remained at a distance, respecting that moment between 2 women who had faced the monster and won, at least for now. That night, I slept at Sally's house. I couldn't spend another night in that house, in that room, in that bed. Paul understood and didn't try to stop me. He promised that the next day we would begin the procedures for the divorce and the sale of the house. What none of us expected was what we would find the next morning, when a neighbor knocked on Sally's door, breathless, bringing news that would change the course of events once again. "There was an accident," he announced, his face pale with shock, "on the highway to Springfield. A car went off the road at Bald Hill Curve. The driver was your father, Barbara, Mr. Jonah." The world seemed to stop for an instant. Is he dead?" the neighbor confirmed. "The police said he was probably speeding. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt. He was thrown from the vehicle in the crash." I don't know what I expected to feel at that moment. Joy, perhaps? Relief? Satisfied vengeance? But all I felt was an immense emptiness, a black hole where anger and fear had been before. "When did this happen?" asked Sally, firmly holding my hand. "Early morning, from what they said. Around 3 a.m. Hours after he left our house. Hours he probably spent drinking, brooding over his humiliation, planning his revenge. And then, fate intervened, in a way that no human plan could predict or control. In the days that followed, I played the role of the grieving daughter. I received condolences, organized the funeral, listened to stories about the great man my father had been. No one, besides Paul and Sally, ever knew the truth about his departure from our house, about the reason he was driving to Springfield in the middle of the night, about the monster that hid behind the respectable facade. 3 months later, my divorce from Paul was finalized. I sold my share of the house, and with the money, moved to Chicago, where I began a new life. I enrolled in law school, a dream I had never allowed myself to have while I was trapped in that marriage, in that town, in that life that was never truly mine. Sally accompanied me in the move. "An old widow like me has nothing tying me to that town," she said when I offered to share the apartment I rented. "Besides, someone needs to look after you, stubborn girl." It was the beginning of a partnership that would last decades. We weren't just friends or roommates. We were survivors, warriors who had faced the worst that men could offer and still remained standing. Paul kept his promise to facilitate my departure. I never saw him again after the divorce, although occasionally I would receive news of him through mutual acquaintances. I learned that he sold the house in Millville and moved to Minnesota, where he started a new life. He never married again. Perhaps he carried the weight of his cowardice as a perpetual penance. As for me, I gradually rebuilt my life. I graduated from law school and specialized in cases of domestic violence and child abuse. I used my own experience to help other women escape similar situations, to give voice to those who, like me, had been silenced for too long. Eventually, I met Charles, a kind and patient university professor who taught me that not all men are monsters or cowards. We married in 1982, had 2 wonderful children who grew up knowing the value of respect, honesty, and courage. I never told Charles all the details of what happened that October night in 1975. Some wounds are too deep to be completely exposed, even to those we love. But he knew enough to understand why certain things frightened me, why I sometimes woke up screaming in the middle of the night, why I never managed to call my father Dad when I spoke of him. Today, at 73, I look back and see that that terrible night, although it left permanent scars, also gave me a strength I didn't know I possessed. It taught me that we can survive the unthinkable, that we can rebuild ourselves even when everything seems shattered beyond repair. And more importantly, I learned that even in the darkest situations, there is always a light. Sometimes it's the outstretched hand of a friend like Sally. Sometimes it's our own determination not to let ourselves be defeated, not to become permanent victims of circumstances. My dears, if you've made it this far in this painful story, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to my account. It wasn't easy to relive these moments, but I felt it was important to share so that other women who are going through similar situations know that they are not alone, that there is hope beyond the dark tunnel of abuse and betrayal. If you liked this story, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share with people who might benefit from this account. Remember always, no matter how dark the night, dawn always comes. And when it does, it's we who choose what kind of person we want to be in the light of the new day, victims of our past or architects of our future. A warm embrace from this grandma who learned the hard way that our greatest strength often reveals itself precisely in the moments when we think we have no strength at all. Until the next video.